The entire restaurant held its breath when the man in the expensive suit knocked the tray from Ruby's hands. The wine glass shattered across the marble floor, ringing out dry and sharp like a gunshot. He sprang to his feet, jabbed a finger straight at her face, and hurled down a stream of cruel insults. And Ruby did something no one in the room noticed. No one, except a single man. She didn't step back. She didn't rush to gather the broken pieces. She lifted both hands to shield her face, her body folding inward, as if bracing for a blow about to fall. That was not the reflex of a clumsy waitress who had simply dropped something. That was the reflex of someone all too familiar with a hand being raised against her. At a table tucked away in the dark corner, the most powerful man in Chicago quietly set down his glass. Because 20 years ago, he had seen that very same motion in his own mother. What that man didn't know was that he had just shattered a glass under the very eyes of someone the whole city feared. And tonight, everything would change forever. If Ruby's story touched your heart, please hit like and share it to spread this message to more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you won't miss the next deeply moving stories. The man in the dark corner rose to his feet. He didn't hurry. He simply left his chair, and somehow, it was that very slowness that made the air inside the restaurant grow thick and heavy. The sound of knives and forks striking porcelain plates went silent. A woman at the next table gently set down her glass of water and forgot to drink from it. The entire elegant room suddenly fell into a strange silence, the kind of silence people only feel just before a storm breaks. Cormac walked toward the man in the suit who was standing there, pointing a finger in Ruby's face. He didn't say anything at all. He only looked. That gaze was so cold that the diner, who had been so aggressive only moments before, suddenly froze in the middle of his curse. He turned, ready to pour his anger onto whoever had dared come closer. But when he recognized the face of the man standing before him, all the blood seemed to drain from his own face. The restaurant manager rushed over, both hands twisting together, his voice trembling so badly it nearly stumbled over itself. He bowed again and again, his mouth pouring out apologies. But he wasn't apologizing to that diner. He was apologizing to Cormac. He addressed him in the voice of a man standing before someone who could decide his entire future, stammering that everything was only a misunderstanding, that he would handle it immediately, that he begged Sir not to be troubled by it. The man in the suit began to understand. He looked around and saw the eyes of the other guests turning away, saw the manager fawning over the stranger, and saw fear written clearly on every face in the room. He swallowed hard. The arrogance from a moment ago had vanished without leaving even a trace. Cormac still hadn't said a single word. He only glanced down at the fallen tray, then looked at the shattered glass scattered across the floor, and finally let his gaze rest on Ruby's hands, which were still trembling. When he lifted his eyes to the man again, that look said more than any threat ever could. It said that he had just made a mistake, a very grave mistake. The diner let out a few broken, stammering sounds. He tried to salvage himself with an explanation, but his voice grew smaller and smaller until it died completely beneath Cormac's unblinking stare. In the end, he did the only thing his survival instinct told him to do. He stepped back once, then twice, muttered a rushed apology, threw several bills onto the table, and almost ran for the door, leaving behind the coat draped over his chair without daring to turn back for it. The restaurant door closed behind him. The whole room still didn't dare breathe too loudly. Cormac stood there for another moment, then bent down. Before the stunned eyes of everyone watching, the most powerful man in the city picked up the fallen tray with his own hands and set it neatly back on the table. He did it calmly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The manager stood frozen in shock, then hurriedly tried to take it from him. But Cormac had already straightened. Ruby still didn't understand what had just happened. She stood motionless, her hands hanging at her sides, her bewildered eyes fixed on the strange man who had made the entire restaurant hold its breath with nothing but his presence. She was used to being shouted at, used to lowering her head and enduring it, used to the feeling of being invisible in the eyes of powerful people. But this was the first time in many years that someone hadn't looked at her as though she were only a servant. Cormac turned to her. For one brief second, the coldness on his face softened a little. He asked if she was all right, his voice deep and quiet, almost low enough for only her to hear. Ruby was so surprised she couldn't speak. She only gave a small shake of her head. He nodded once, then said nothing more, and returned to his table in the corner. But from that moment on, something had changed. Those who witnessed that night would go on telling the story for a long time, the story of how a single look had driven an arrogant man out the door. And Ruby, for the first time in a very long while, felt her heart beating to a strange new rhythm, a feeling she had thought she'd forgotten long ago. It was the feeling of being protected by someone. Night fell, and when the last guests had finally left and the crystal chandelier lights were turned down low, the restaurant returned to a kind of stillness known only to those who worked the late shift. Ruby was the last one to stay behind, as always. She wiped each table, straightened each chair, and gathered the stained napkins into a basket. Her legs had gone numb after nearly 12 hours of standing without rest. But she didn't allow herself to stop, because if she stopped, she knew she wouldn't have enough strength left to stand up again. When she bent down to pick up a shard of glass still lying beneath a table leg, a sudden wave of dizziness rushed over her, making the whole room seem to tilt for a moment. Ruby had to grip the edge of the table, close her eyes, and take a deep breath until everything stopped spinning. She had grown far too used to dizzy spells like this over the past few months, and she told herself it was only from working too hard, that if she could rest for a little while, she would be fine. She didn't allow herself to think any further than that, because thinking further meant facing things she didn't have the strength or the means to face. When the dizziness passed, she straightened, hurriedly wiped the sweat beading on her forehead, and went back to work as though nothing had happened. In the kitchen, the chef had already gone home, leaving the leftover portions from dinner on the counter, plates of food that, according to the rules, would be thrown away at the end of the day. Ruby looked at them, then looked toward the back door that led into the narrow alley behind the restaurant. Quietly, she took a paper box and carefully placed inside it the untouched pieces of meat, a few slices of bread, and some vegetables that were still perfectly good. She did it with practiced, efficient hands, as though she had done it 100 times before, because she truly had been doing it for many months. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't tell the manager, didn't show it off to her coworkers, and didn't think of it as something other people needed to know. To her, it was simply the right thing to do. Ruby opened the back door and stepped into the cold alley, where the streetlight spilled a sickly yellow glow over the pavement. In the corner of the alley, leaning against the old brick wall, sat an old man who had been there for a long while, wrapped in several thin layers of clothing that weren't nearly warm enough. When he saw her, his tired eyes brightened a little. Ruby walked over, placed the still warm paper box into his trembling hands, and softly told him there was a little extra meat tonight, and that he should remember to eat it while it was still hot. The old man looked at her, his hoarse voice rising in words of thanks, then said she was always the kindest person he had ever met in this cold city. Ruby only smiled, a weary but gentle smile, and told him not to be so polite, because the food would have been thrown away anyway, and it was better for him to have it than for it to go to waste. But both of them knew that wasn't entirely true, because more than once, she had gone without her own meal so she could save the better portion for him. She lingered a little longer, asking whether he had slept warmly enough the night before, and whether he needed another blanket. The old man shook his head and told her not to worry about an old man like him, that she should take care of herself first, because she had been looking too pale lately. Ruby only laughed it off, said she was fine, then said goodbye to him and went back inside. When the door closed behind her, the smile on her lips slowly faded. She leaned against the cold wall, lifted a hand to rub her aching shoulders, and for one brief moment, the exhaustion of an entire lifetime seemed to pour down onto those fragile, narrow shoulders. She thought about the cramped rented room waiting for her, about the meager wages that would once again be taken almost entirely away, about the days that kept repeating over and over with no way out. But then she drew in a breath, straightened herself, and continued. Ruby had just changed into her thin coat, ready to go home, when she heard familiar footsteps sounding outside the back door, the kind of sound that made her heart tighten every time it reached her ears. Wade stepped inside, his large frame nearly filling the doorway, a smile on his lips that she had learned long ago to fear. He looked around the empty kitchen, then came closer and asked her in a voice pretending to be friendly how much she had made in tips that night. Ruby stepped back once and said softly that the restaurant had been slow this month, and she hadn't gathered enough yet. The smile on Wade's face disappeared at once. He placed one hand on the kitchen counter, leaned toward her, and lowered his voice. But it was full of threat as he reminded her that she owed his family a very large sum, and every month she had an obligation to pay. Ruby lowered her head, her hands clenching the hem of her coat, and murmured that she was still trying. Wade pulled a sheet of paper from his coat pocket. one that had yellowed with the years, opened it in front of her, and forced out each word, telling her that this was her own signature and that she couldn't deny it. Ruby looked at that paper, and an old memory came flooding back. When she was 18 years old, after she had just lost the last person she had in the world and had nowhere left to turn, Uncle Gerald had come to her, placed a stack of papers in front of her, and told her they were only formalities so she could have a place to stay, a job, and a new beginning. The Ruby of that year, hungry, frightened, and blindly grateful, had put her name down without reading a single line carefully. She had never imagined that the trembling stroke of an orphaned girl's pen that night would become the chain that bound her life for nearly 10 years afterward. Wade folded the paper, tucked it back into his pocket, and said he didn't care whether the restaurant was slow or busy. By the end of this week, she had to bring the full amount, or he couldn't promise what would happen. Just then, the phone in Ruby's pocket vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and a chill ran down her spine when she saw the name displayed there. Wade saw it too. He curled his mouth into a smirk and told her to answer, because his father wanted to talk. Ruby lifted the phone to her ear, and Gerald's voice sounded from the other end of the line. Slow, cold, and without a trace of warmth. He didn't shout, he didn't raise his voice. But it was precisely that calmness that made her skin crawl more than any threat could have. Gerald said he had heard that lately she seemed to be neglecting her duties. He reminded her who she was, where she came from, and that without his family's kindness all those years ago, she would have been dead in some forgotten corner by now. He said a debt was a debt, and a sensible person knew how to repay what she had borrowed. Ruby gripped the phone tightly, her eyes stinging, but she didn't dare cry out loud. She only answered softly that she understood, and that she would find a way. Gerald fell silent for a moment on the other end of the line, then added one more sentence that left her cold all over. He said he always knew where she was, what she was doing, and that she should never think of running away, because there was no place on this earth far enough for her to escape the name she had signed. Then he hung up without a word of goodbye. Ruby stood motionless in the cold kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear even though the line had already gone dead. Wade patted her shoulder once and said that as long as she behaved, everything would be easier for both of them. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the darkness and the silence. Slowly, she lowered the phone, leaned her back against the wall, and for the first time that night, she allowed a single tear to roll down her cheek. The next afternoon, when the restaurant was at its busiest, Wade appeared again, but this time he didn't come in through the back door, and he didn't bother keeping things discreet the way he usually did. He strode straight into the middle of the elegant dining room, ignoring the startled eyes of the guests, and called Ruby's name loudly enough that the entire restaurant turned to look. Ruby was carrying a tray of drinks to a table when she stopped short, her face going pale. Wade walked up, aggressively blocked her path, forcing her to freeze in her tracks, and began loudly humiliating her in front of everyone. He said she was a clinging debtor, that his family had taken her in when she was little, and now she was trying to dodge what she owed, that an ungrateful person like her didn't deserve to be treated kindly. Every word he spoke felt like a lash striking Ruby's already fragile sense of dignity. She stood there, her hands clenched tightly together, her head bowed low, feeling dozens of eyes fixed on her, some curious, some contemptuous, some pitying. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to split open and swallow her whole, but all she could do was stand still and endure it, as she had done all her life. The manager hurried over, but not to defend her. He came only to beg Wade to lower his voice so he wouldn't disturb the guests. And then, from the familiar table in the corner, a deep, clear voice rang out and cut through everything. Cormac asked, not loudly but clearly enough for the whole room to hear, what exactly this debt was that Wade kept talking about. Wade spun around, ready to snap at the man who had dared interfere in his business. But when he realized who was sitting there, his expression changed at once. Cormac rose unhurriedly and walked toward him, his gaze calm but sharp as a blade. He said he found it strange, because a girl working for meager wages could hardly have borrowed a debt so large that an entire family had to send someone to her workplace month after month to collect it. He asked Wade whether that paper he always carried with him could stand up in the light, whether he dared let a lawyer examine it, whether he dared explain clearly how much the original amount was, how the interest had been calculated, and why an 18-year-old orphaned girl could have signed an agreement that bound her for life. Each question struck like a needle driven straight into the weakest place, and Wade's face grew paler by the second. He stammered that it was his family's private matter and had nothing to do with outsiders. Cormac smiled, but there wasn't a trace of warmth in that smile, then said that when a full-grown man came all the way to a fragile girl's workplace to shout at her and demand money in front of a crowd, it was no longer a private matter. It had become a performance for everyone to watch. He went on to say that honest debts were settled in court, while debts that had to be collected through threats and humiliation usually had something about them that couldn't bear the light of day. The whole restaurant fell utterly silent. Every eye was no longer on Ruby, but on Wade, filled now with suspicion. He stood there, his face burning with humiliation, his mouth opening and closing again without managing to speak a single word in defense. At last, unable to bear the weight of all those stares, he spat out bitterly that this wasn't over, then turned and walked quickly out the door. Once his shadow had vanished completely, Cormac turned to Ruby and gave her a small, reassuring nod, then returned to his table, as though nothing had happened. But Ruby understood, and Wade, as he stepped beyond that door, understood too, that a line had just been drawn, and from that moment on, the Callahan family had gained an enemy they had never seen coming. The next morning, on the highest floor of a building overlooking the entire city, Cormac sat behind his desk, listening as his men reported to him one after another. None of them dared sit before he allowed it, and none dared say more than needed to be said. That was how everything worked in his world, a world where every word carried weight and every silence had meaning. He listened as one man presented the week's business dealings, nodding here, asking a sharp question there, and with only a few brief sentences, he settled problems that would have taken other men an entire day to argue over. When one subordinate hesitated before reporting that a partner had been slow in keeping his promise, Cormac didn't raise his voice. He merely looked up, fixed his eyes on the man for a moment, then said calmly to remind that partner who had given him the chance to sit at the table in the first place, and that his patience wasn't something without limits. The subordinate bowed his head in understanding, knowing that behind those quiet words was a weight no one wanted to test. The way Cormac ruled didn't rely on noise or bitter threats, but on a silent authority forged over many years, the kind that made people cautious even when he was smiling. He was ruthless, everyone knew that. But his ruthlessness always had measure and reason. It was never blind impulse. He punished traitors and those who bullied the weak, but he had never once struck at someone who didn't deserve it. That very principle was what made his men both fear and respect him, and what forced his enemies to think carefully before daring to stand against him. When the daily reports were finished, Cormac waved everyone out, keeping only one man behind, the one he trusted with matters that required the greatest discretion. He leaned back in his chair and stayed silent for a long while before speaking, his voice low. He said he wanted to know everything about a family with the last name Callahan, about a man named Gerald and his son Wade. He wanted to know how they made their money, who they had made enemies of, and most importantly, he wanted to know the truth behind the so-called debt they were using to bind a girl who worked as a waitress. The subordinate looked slightly surprised, because it was very rare for his boss to care about something that seemed so small. But he didn't dare ask. He only nodded and committed it to memory. Cormac added that he wanted to see that debt paper with his own eyes, wanted to know when it had been drawn up, who had drafted it, and whether there was anything hidden in the wording. He emphasized that this had to be done carefully and discreetly, without letting anyone in the Callahan family catch even the faintest scent of it. The subordinate answered that he would begin immediately, then quietly left. Alone again, Cormac rose and walked to the large glass window, looking down at the city spread out beneath him. He couldn't explain why the image of that girl's trembling hands kept haunting him so deeply, or why the moment she lifted a hand to cover her face had stirred something inside him that he had buried a very long time ago. He was a man used to controlling everything, even his own emotions. And yet this time, something had slipped beyond that control. He frowned slightly, then told himself that he was only doing what he had always done, never turning his face away when someone strong was trampling someone weaker. But deep in his heart, he knew that this time, it wasn't as simple as that. When Wade came home and told him what had happened at the restaurant, Gerald didn't fly into the rage his son had expected. He sat still in his dark study, listening to every word, his fingers tapping in a steady rhythm against the surface of the desk. And on that aging face, there gradually appeared a look of contemplation, more frightening than fury itself. When Wade mentioned the name of the man who had interfered, Gerald stopped tapping his fingers. He knew that name. Who in this city didn't know it? And precisely because he knew it, he understood that the problem had now gone far beyond one stubborn little waitress. A man like Cormac never wasted his time meddling in someone else's business unless he had a reason. And the fact that he had turned his attention to Ruby unsettled Gerald in a way he couldn't afford to ignore. He shouted at Wade for being stupid enough to make a scene in a crowded place, turning something that should have remained discreet into a spectacle for the whole city to whisper about. He said that because of his son's temper, their obedient little prey had suddenly gained a powerful man willing to shield her. Wade lowered his head and muttered excuses, but Gerald was no longer listening. His mind was already racing through one calculation after another. He understood that if he kept tightening his grip on Ruby the old way, sooner or later he would collide directly with Cormac, and that was a confrontation he couldn't win alone. But Gerald wasn't the kind of man who easily let go of something already in his hand. To him, that girl wasn't only a steady source of money. She was also a symbol of his absolute power within the family, something he would never allow to slip away simply because an outsider had appeared. So if he wasn't strong enough on his own, he would find himself an ally powerful enough to stand with him. And in his mind, one name immediately rose to the surface, the name of the only man in the city with enough influence to counter Cormac, and also the man who hated him down to the bone, Lionel Brant. A few days later, Gerald arranged a discreet meeting with Brant, in a place far from curious eyes. The two men sat facing each other, each carrying his own private calculations in his heart. Gerald began wisely, not rushing to beg for help, but skillfully suggesting that he held something in his hands that could become very useful to Brant. He told him that their common enemy had recently begun to care about a girl, a seemingly ordinary little thing, who was already firmly under his family's control through a bond she couldn't possibly escape. Brant, who had long nursed his hatred for Cormac, and had always been searching for an opening to bring his rival down, immediately showed interest. His cold, sharp eyes narrowed, and he asked Gerald what exactly he wanted by bringing this matter to him. Gerald smiled and said he wanted a partnership that would benefit them both. He would help Brant obtain the thing he had desired for so long, a weakness of Cormac's, a thread that could be pulled until his entire empire began to sway. In return, Brant would use his influence to ensure that the girl remained forever within the Callahan family's reach, and that no one, not even Cormac, could interfere again. Brant waited in silence, then slowly extended his hand across the table. Gerald looked at that hand, then reached out and clasped it tightly. Two men who had never held the slightest warmth for each other were now joining forces, simply because they shared the same purpose. And in that moment, neither of them realized that they had just turned the fate of an innocent girl into a pawn in a game whose price would be far higher than anything they could imagine. A few days later, on an evening when the restaurant had grown quiet and only a few guests remained, Cormac appeared again and sat at his familiar table in the corner. This time, he didn't order much, only a cup of coffee, and Ruby was the one assigned to bring it to him. She approached with a little hesitation, set the cup of coffee down on the table, then was about to turn away as usual when he spoke and asked whether she was all right after what had happened the other day. Ruby stopped short, slightly surprised, because she wasn't used to a guest showing concern for her that way. She answered softly that she was fine, and thanked him for helping her that day. Cormac looked at her for a moment, then said he hadn't done much. He simply didn't like seeing a strong person bully someone who had no way to defend herself. Ruby lowered her head and murmured that she was grateful anyway, because it had been a very long time since anyone had stood on her side. A brief silence passed between them, not exactly awkward, but more like the quiet measuring of two people who had both grown used to guarding themselves against the whole world. Cormac asked how long she had worked there, and Ruby answered that it had been a few years. He asked again whether she liked the job, and this time she was silent for a while before replying that she didn't have many choices, whether to like it or dislike it. That answer, simple yet carrying the weight of an entire fate, made Cormac lift his eyes and look at her longer. He recognized in this tired young woman's eyes something he rarely saw, the resignation of a person far too accustomed to having life take things away from her. Yet, buried beneath that resignation, there was still something that hadn't gone out completely, a small flicker of self-respect still trying to hold on. He said quietly that sometimes people had no choices in the present, but that didn't mean it would stay that way forever. Ruby looked up at him, a little startled by those words, because they didn't sound like anything she had ever heard from the powerful men she had met before. In that moment, she noticed that the coldness on his face wasn't entirely indifference. It was more like a shell built to hide something inside. She didn't understand why, but standing before this man whom the whole city feared, she didn't feel afraid at all. On the contrary, for the first time in many years, She felt something strange and warm, the feeling of safety, as though in this brief moment, no threat in the world could reach her. She quickly pushed that feeling away, reminding herself that she shouldn't let her heart soften, that she knew nothing about this man beyond the rumors, and that in her world, trust always came with a price. She gave him a small nod, said she had to return to work, and stepped back. But as she walked away, she could still feel his gaze following her from behind, and strangely, that gaze didn't make her uncomfortable. As for Cormac, he remained seated with his coffee gone cold, silently watching the frail figure of the young woman moving busily between the tables. He wondered what could make a person endure so much and still keep enough kindness to share with others, and the more he thought about it, the more he found himself wanting to protect her, not because of principle, but for a reason he himself didn't yet dare to name. In the days that followed, Ruby's body began to speak in ways she could no longer ignore. The dizzy spells that had once passed in fleeting moments now came more often and lingered longer. There were times when she had to stand motionless in the kitchen, one hand gripping the counter, waiting for the world in front of her eyes to stop swaying. She found herself tired in a different way, a kind of exhaustion that no longer felt like the ordinary weariness of a long day at work, but as though something inside her was quietly draining her strength bit by bit. Still, Ruby tried to hide all of it. Whenever that sick feeling came over her in the middle of a shift, she would slip into a hidden corner, breathe deeply, force her face back into calmness, and return to serving customers with the familiar smile required by the job, as though nothing had happened. She couldn't let anyone see her weakness, because she understood that, in the world she lived in, weakness meant being cast aside. There was an older coworker on the same shift, a kind woman who had been watching her for some time, and she began to realize that something was wrong. She saw Ruby's face growing paler by the day, saw how often she had to stop what she was doing just to catch her breath, and one evening, she pulled Ruby aside into a quiet corner and gently urged her to arrange a visit to the doctor. She said Ruby didn't look well at all, that health was not something to take lightly, and that if she kept forcing herself to carry everything that way, one day she would collapse. Ruby was moved by that concern, but she only shook her head softly, trying to offer a reassuring smile as she said she was fine, that she had just been sleeping a little less lately. The coworker looked at her with eyes full of worry, because she knew it wasn't true, but she also understood that there were burdens people carried alone because they couldn't speak them aloud. The truth was not that Ruby didn't want to see a doctor. She longed for even one chance to sit down before a physician and hear someone tell her what was truly happening inside her body. But every time that thought began to rise, it was immediately smothered by a cruel reality. She thought of her meager monthly wages, almost all of which were taken away, thought of the medical costs she had no way to afford, and thought of her greatest fear, that if she asked for time off to see a doctor, she might lose the only job keeping her alive. Losing that job would mean having no money left to pay the Callahan family, and she didn't dare imagine what would happen then. And so she remained trapped inside a merciless circle, where even the right to care for her own health had become a luxury beyond her reach. It wasn't because she disregarded her body. It was because circumstance had bound her so tightly that she had no choice left but to keep enduring. That night, when she returned to her cramped rented room, Ruby sat down on the edge of the bed, quietly pressed a hand to her chest, and felt each tired beat of her heart. She told herself she had to hold on a little longer, that if she could only get through this difficult stretch, everything would be all right. But even as she comforted herself that way, deep inside, she could still feel a vague fear growing, a sense that she couldn't keep running from her own body forever. She closed her eyes, tried to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill, and silently wished that life would give her even a small space to breathe, so she could live like an ordinary human being, allowed to be sick, allowed to be weak, and allowed to have someone worry about her without having to carry yet another fear. The next evening, when Ruby brought the meal out to the alley as usual, she noticed that something about the old man was different tonight. He didn't hurry to take the paper box from her the way he always did. Instead, he sat still, his eyes fixed on her, as though he were struggling with something heavy in his heart. Ruby sat down beside him and gently asked if he was feeling unwell. The old man stayed silent for a long while, then spoke in a hoarse, rough voice, asking her a question that startled her. Was her last name Callahan, and was Gerald Callahan her real uncle? Ruby froze, unable to understand why a homeless stranger would know about her family. Cautiously, she asked how he knew that. The old man sighed, a sigh filled with years of torment. And then he began to tell her. He said his appearing in this alley day after day hadn't been a coincidence, as she had always thought. He had known who she was for a long time and had been silently watching her for months, because she was the final piece of a debt of conscience he had carried for almost an entire lifetime. Ruby fell silent and listened, feeling a coldness run down her spine. The old man said that many years earlier, he had once been a bookkeeper, an accountant with a modest reputation, and Gerald Callahan had once hired him to work. Back then, he had still been a decent man, or at least he had still believed he was, but then life pushed him into desperation. And Gerald, with his cunning, took advantage of him at the very moment when he was weakest. He gave him a large sum of money, enough to save him from the debt that was swallowing him at the time, in exchange for one task. That task was to help him create documents that would bind an orphaned child, turning his false kindness into a legal chain that child would never be able to loosen. The old man's voice trembled as he spoke, and tears gathered in his eyes. He said he had played a part in creating the very thing that had tormented her life for all these years, that the numbers and clauses Gerald had used to tighten his grip around her throat had partly been built by his own hands. Ruby listened as tears spilled down her face, not from anger, but from the deep pain of realizing that the chain that had bound her entire youth had been forged from such lies. The old man went on, saying that after the work was done, Gerald had cast him aside without mercy, and from there his life had kept sliding downward to the bottom, from losing his job to losing his home, until he became the wandering man on the streets that he was now. He believed it was punishment for what he had done, but what tormented him most wasn't his own downfall. It was the image of the innocent child from all those years ago, the child he had helped push into suffering. For years, he had lived with that remorse, and when he happened to learn where she was, he followed the trail, only so he could see her, only so he could quietly watch over her and atone for some part of his sin. He had never imagined that the very girl he had wronged would be the one bringing him food night after night, warming him with a kindness so unconditional that he felt he didn't deserve to receive it. At this point, the old man took Ruby's hand, his voice choking as he told her that he was still keeping something that could prove everything Gerald had done was fraudulent, and that the time had come for him to return to her what should have belonged to her from the beginning, the truth and a path to freedom. A few nights later, Cormac offered to take Ruby home after the restaurant closed, saying he didn't feel at ease letting her walk alone through those empty streets at such a late hour. Ruby hesitated, but in the end, she agreed. Along the way, the two of them talked, and for reasons she couldn't quite understand, perhaps because of the stillness of the night, or perhaps because of a growing trust neither of them was willing to admit, Cormac began telling her something he had never told anyone before. He said he understood the feeling of helplessness that came from being trampled by someone stronger, understood it better than anyone, because he had once had to witness it with his own eyes when he was only a child. His voice sank lower, and for the first time, Ruby saw the cold shell around that powerful man crack open, revealing something wounded and deeply human beneath it. He told her that when he was small, his father had died early, leaving him and his mother in poverty. His mother, a gentle and patient woman, had been forced to borrow money to raise him, and then, when the time came and she couldn't repay it, the creditors came to their home. He said he still remembered that night as clearly as if it had been carved into him, remembered the pounding on the door, remembered the insults that man poured down on his mother, and remembered most of all the moment his mother lifted both hands to cover her face, her body shrinking in fear. The very same gesture he had seen in Ruby on that fateful night at the restaurant. He said that back then he had only been a boy, small and weak, standing pressed into the corner of the house, wanting to rush out and protect his mother, but unable to do anything except watch helplessly as the person he loved most in the world was humiliated. That numbing helplessness had burned itself into his mind and become a wound that never healed. He said that from that very night, he had sworn to himself that he would never let himself be weak again, that he would become so powerful no one could ever trample on him or on the people he cared about, and he had done exactly that. He had climbed to the very peak of power with everything he had, but the price was that he had lost many of the softer parts of himself along the way. Ruby listened in silence, her heart tightening, because now she understood why this man had stepped in to protect her on that first night. It wasn't because she was special, but because in the moment she raised her hand to cover her face, he had seen the shadow of his mother again, and had seen once more the helpless child he used to be within himself. She said softly that she was sorry for what he and his mother had gone through, Cormac shook his head and replied that it had happened a very long time ago, but there were wounds that no amount of passing time could erase. He said that was why he hated, with everything in him, people who used strength and money to bully those who had no way to defend themselves, and why, whenever he saw it, he couldn't turn his face away. Beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, Ruby looked at the man beside her with entirely different eyes. She no longer saw a frightening boss whom the whole city feared. She saw a human being, someone who had also been wounded, someone who had once been helpless and hurt just as she had been. And in that moment, an invisible thread connected two souls that had seemed separated by an entire abyss of fate. Two people carrying different wounds, yet somehow understanding each other's pain in a strangely profound way. But fate seemed unwilling to let Ruby go. Only a few days after the night she and Cormac had shared their deepest wounds, Gerald made his move, and this time, he no longer used Wade or empty threats. One evening, he came to the restaurant himself, waited until Ruby's shift ended, then stopped her the moment she had just stepped outside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm at her. Instead, he wore a cold smile more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He said he already knew about the man who was stepping forward to protect her, and he also knew she was carrying some foolish thought in her head that someone would save her. He warned her not to indulge in empty fantasies, because no power in the world could erase what she had signed her name to. Then he pulled out a thick stack of documents, placed it in her hands, and said in a voice smooth and merciless that if she refused to obediently repay the debt his way, he would take her to court. He said he would sue her for refusing to pay what she owed, would use every document she had signed to destroy her in the eyes of the law, and when that happened, whether Cormac or anyone else stood behind her, she would be left with nothing but a judgment against her and a ruined life. He said he would let the whole city know she was an ungrateful fraud, would make sure no restaurant ever dared hire her again, and would drive her back down to the place where she belonged, beneath the mud. Every word from Gerald cut into Ruby's heart like a blade of ice. She stood there, her trembling hands clutching the stack of papers, feeling as though the whole sky were collapsing over her head. All the fragile hope that had just begun to flicker inside her over the past few days was now being crushed without mercy. She realized that even with Cormac, even with the truth the old man was holding, this chain was still too tight, this enemy was still too ruthless, and she was still only one small, lonely person in a world overflowing with injustice. Gerald left her with one final sentence, saying he would give her a few days to think it through carefully, then turned and walked away, leaving her rooted to the dark street. And it was in that moment of absolute despair that Ruby's body, already worn beyond endurance, finally could no longer hold itself up. A violent pain swept over her, stronger than every time before, so sudden that she didn't even have time to cry out. Everything before her eyes blurred. The stack of documents fell from her hands, pages scattering across the cold pavement. She staggered, trying to cling to something, but there was nothing there to hold on to, and then that frail body collapsed onto the silent street. She lay there, in the middle of a road with no one in sight, her consciousness fading like a small candle trembling before the wind. In her haze, she no longer felt pain. She felt only an immense loneliness and a bone-deep weariness, as though her whole life had been nothing but one fall after another, with no hand ever reaching down to lift her. She thought of her orphaned childhood, of the years of torment, of the lies that had bound her life, and of the man who had given her one brief glimpse of hope. A single tear slipped from the corner of her half-closed eye. She thought silently that perhaps this was the end, that perhaps her life had always been meant to end this way, alone and cold. And then, just as the last thread of awareness was about to go out, she faintly heard the sound of hurried footsteps running toward her from somewhere nearby, faintly felt someone calling her name in panic, before everything sank into a thick, impenetrable darkness. When Ruby slowly came back to consciousness, the first thing she felt was a strange warmth and a soft light, instead of the cold pavement she had thought she would never rise from again. She slowly opened her eyes, and it took her a long while to realize she was lying on a soft bed in a clean, bright hospital room. She was confused, unable to understand why she was here or how she had escaped that dark street from the night before. And then, when she turned her head to one side, she saw him. Cormac was sitting there in the chair beside her bed, his posture weary, as though he had stayed awake through the whole long night. Seeing her wake, his usually cold eyes flashed with a relief he didn't manage to hide in time. Ruby tried to speak, her voice still weak, asking him why she was here and what had happened. Cormac quietly told her that last night, because of a restless feeling he couldn't shake, he had gone back to look for her, and he found her unconscious in the middle of the road, surrounded by scattered pages. He said he had brought her here immediately, and the doctors said she was severely exhausted after forcing herself for too long with a sick body that had never been cared for. Ruby listened, her heart tightening. She understood that without him that night, she might never have seen this morning's light again. But amid that gratitude, a familiar fear rose inside her. She stammered about the hospital bill, saying she had no money to pay for all these expensive things, that he shouldn't waste his effort on her. Cormac gently cut her off, saying he had already taken care of every cost, and she didn't need to worry about even the smallest part of it. He told her the only thing she needed to do now was rest and let her body heal. Ruby looked at him, tears shimmering in her eyes, and she asked him, with the most sincere confusion in her heart, why he was doing all of this for her. She said she was only a poor, lowly waitress, someone with nothing, a debtor the whole city would soon despise. So what could a man like him possibly gain by saving someone like her? That question made Cormac fall silent for a long time. Then he slowly said that she reminded him of someone. He said that the night he saw her raise her hand to cover her face in the restaurant, he saw the image of his mother again, the woman he had been helpless to protect when he was a child. He said he had lived his whole life haunted by that helplessness, by the question of whether everything would have been different if only he had been strong enough back then. And when he met her, he realized this was his chance to do what he had not been able to do all those years ago, so he wouldn't have to stand by once more and watch a decent person be crushed by cruelty without reaching out. He said that saving her, in some way, was also how he was saving the helpless child who had still been crying inside him for all these years. Ruby went still at those words, and the tears she had tried to hold back finally rolled down her cheeks. She cried, not from self-pity the way she so often had before, but because for the first time in her life, she felt that she was truly valued, that someone saw her not as a burden or a debt, but as a human being worthy of being saved. She slowly reached out her thin, frail hand, and Cormac took it, his hand warm and steady as it wrapped around her small, trembling one. In that quiet hospital room, no more words were needed. Two people carrying deep, hidden wounds had found in each other a place to rest, a kind of understanding they had both been searching for almost their entire lives. But her enemy wasn't the kind of man who knew how to retreat before another person's pain. The next day, when Cormac had to leave for a short while on business, Gerald chose that exact moment to appear. He stepped into the hospital room with a false calm, pulled a chair beside the bed, and looked at the girl lying there weakly with the eyes of a predator watching prey already caught in his trap. He spoke in a sweet, oily voice, saying he was very sorry to see her in such a state. Then, leaning closer, he whispered a chilling ultimatum. If she didn't surrender and return to his family's control by the end of the week, his lawyers would sue her for grand fraud, ensuring her life was utterly ruined, and she faced years in federal prison. He left her with no options, only a ticking clock. Just then, her phone vibrated softly on the table. Almost by reflex, she glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unfamiliar number. When she opened it, a simple text message appeared, containing a few words from the old man telling her never to surrender, for the truth would soon set her free. Ruby looked at the words on the screen, and something inside her awakened. The despair that had almost crushed her moments ago began to dissolve, replaced by a sudden spark of defiance. She suddenly realized she wasn't as alone as Gerald wanted her to believe. There was the old man, spending what remained of his life trying to atone and stand on her side. There was Cormac, who had saved her and given her a sense of worth she had thought she would never have. And more important than anything, there was still a truth waiting to be brought into the light. The spark of will, she had thought, was gone, suddenly flared back to life, stronger than ever before. She lifted her head and looked straight into Gerald's eyes, and for the first time in her life, there was no fear or resignation in her gaze. She pushed the paper back toward him, her voice still weak but firm, and said she wouldn't sign anything, and that his game was about to end. The victorious smile on Gerald's face froze at once. After Gerald left with his anger held tightly in check and a new uneasiness inside him, Ruby remained alone in the hospital room, but the person she was now was completely different from the fragile girl she had been the day before. The moment she pushed that paper back and looked straight into the eyes of the man who had tormented her had awakened something in her that seemed to have been asleep for far too long. For the first time, she no longer thought about how to endure or how to run away. She began thinking about how to fight. She understood that if she kept lowering her head, she would forever remain a pawn in someone else's hand, and she was far too tired of being a pawn. As soon as her health recovered enough for her to leave the hospital bed, Ruby immediately went to find the old man. This time, she didn't come as someone bringing him food, but as a companion, someone who would share with him the weight of a common mission. When the old man saw the fire of determination in her eyes, he couldn't hide his emotion. He led her to the place where he had hidden the things he had risked his life to preserve for so many years. Old documents yellowed with age, but still fully valuable. He spread them out before her and began explaining each one. He showed her the numbers that had been falsified, the signatures that had been forged, the vague clauses that had been carefully planted to turn Gerald's false kindness into a perfect legal trap. Ruby listened closely, memorizing every detail, and little by little, the picture of the lies that had bound her life appeared before her with chilling clarity. She realized that the chain she had always believed could never be broken had actually been made from the rotten links of fraud, and that if the truth could be brought into the light, the whole thing would collapse. Two people, one old and one young, worked side by side to arrange each fragment of the truth, connecting documents and reconstructing the order of a conspiracy that had lasted for nearly a decade. During that process, Cormac also quietly became a steady support for her. When he learned of her plan, he didn't stop her or show any wish to solve everything in her place the way a powerful man often would. On the contrary, he respected her decision and quietly used his resources to support her from behind. He helped her find people who could testify, helped her verify the legal validity of the documents, and made sure that throughout this dangerous process, there would always be someone watching over her safety. But he always let her remain at the center, let her be the one to win justice back for herself. He understood that what she needed wasn't a savior stepping in to rescue her, but a companion who believed in her strength. And it was that very trust that gave Ruby a source of strength she had never known she possessed. With each passing day, she became more resolute, stronger. The girl who had once lowered her head and trembled every time she heard shouting now dared to lift her face, dared to look straight at the truth, and dared to confront the people who had once filled her with fear. She was no longer a victim. Step by step, she was becoming the person who held her own fate in her hands. One evening, as she looked at the stack of documents neatly arranged on the table, Ruby gently clenched her hand. She knew the road ahead was still full of thorns and danger. She knew men like Gerald and his allies would never surrender easily. But this time, she was ready. She was no longer fighting in fear. She was fighting with all the dignity of a person who had finally decided to stand up and take back her life. While Ruby and those standing on her side were quietly preparing for the battle to reclaim justice, somewhere else in the city, an even greater danger was silently taking shape, and it came from the very place no one could have expected. In Cormac's world, there was a man who had followed him from the earliest days, a man he trusted completely and entrusted with even his most carefully guarded secrets. Because of that closeness, this man had always remained beyond all suspicion, for through so many years, he had never once made a mistake or revealed even the smallest sign of betrayal. No matter how sharp and suspicious Cormac was when guarding himself against his enemies, he had never imagined that he needed to guard himself against the brother-in-arms who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him through countless storms. And that was the only opening in the armor that had seemed impossible to pierce. What Cormac didn't know was that the loyalty of that trusted man had been bought long ago. Lionel Brant, with the cunning of someone who had fed his hatred for years, didn't attack Cormac directly. Instead, he patiently found the weakness of that confidant, took hold of a secret powerful enough to destroy him, then used it together with promises of money and power to turn a loyal man into a venomous snake hidden right inside his rival's own house. Late one night, at a discreet location, the traitor secretly met with Brant. He brought Brant the information the man had long been desperate to obtain. He said he had found what Brant needed, the one weakness of a man who seemed to have no vulnerable place at all. Brant lifted an eyebrow and listened, and the traitor revealed that lately his boss had changed. The cold man who had once seemed to have not a single emotional tie for anyone to exploit had now begun to care about someone. He told him about Ruby, about how Cormac had stepped in to protect her, had personally taken her to the hospital, and arranged everything for her. Actions completely unlike the nature everyone had known in him. He concluded that this girl was Cormac's fatal weakness, the most powerful weapon Brant could use to bring him to his knees. Brant's eyes lit with a cruel gleam when he heard this. He had been opposing Cormac long enough to understand that a man without weakness was a man who couldn't be defeated, and for all these years, that had been the very reason Brant had always been forced to stand at a disadvantage. But now, everything was different. Once the lion had something to protect, it would no longer be a free and invincible beast, but a creature that could be driven into a corner. Brant realized that if he could hold that girl in his hands, he would hold Cormac's very heart, and then Cormac would be forced to do anything he wanted. He gave a quiet laugh, the cold laugh of a man who had just found the final piece of his scheme. He paid the traitor the reward he had promised, then began shaping a vicious plan in his mind. He wouldn't rush. He would wait for the right moment and set a perfect trap, so that by the time Cormac realized what was happening, it would already be too late. And from that moment on, Ruby's battle was no longer simply a fight to reclaim her own freedom. It had been pulled into something far larger, a confrontation between two underworld powers in which she had unknowingly become the central link. While she and Cormac still knew nothing about the venomous snake hiding right beside them, the trap waiting to swallow them both had already begun to spread itself through the darkness. Brant didn't let his plan wait for long. He had men secretly follow Ruby's every move, learn her schedule, and wait only for the moment she slipped beyond Cormac's protection. The opportunity came one evening, after Ruby had just finished meeting with the old man to complete the final pieces of evidence. As she was walking home alone, a car rolled up beside her, and before she could understand what was happening, several burly men quickly closed in. Ruby struggled, tried to cry out for help, but on that empty street, her voice was swallowed almost at once. She was forced into the car and carried away into the night, her heart hammering wildly with terror. Yet even in that fear, she forced herself to keep her mind clear, trying to remember every sound, every movement, searching for any chance, no matter how small. She was held in an old warehouse standing apart on the edge of the city, a place where no cry for help would ever reach anyone's ears. The men guarding her were cold and quiet. They only followed orders and didn't touch her, because Brant had made it clear that she was an important bargaining piece and had to be kept unharmed. Ruby sat in the corner of the cold warehouse, her arms wrapped around her knees, but instead of collapsing into despair, she forced herself to think. She understood that she hadn't been taken because of the debt, but for a far larger reason, and her instinct told her that all of this had something to do with Cormac. At the same time, elsewhere in the city, Cormac received the terrible news. A call came from an unknown number, and Brant's mocking voice sounded from the other end of the line. He said he was holding something very precious to Cormac, and if Cormac still wanted to see that girl safe, he would have to obediently do exactly as he was told. He set his terms, saying Cormac had to hand over full control of the territories he had spent his life building, had to personally surrender everything he had, in exchange for Ruby's life. In the moment he heard those words, something happened to Cormac that had not happened in all these years. The man who had always remained cold and calm before every crisis, the man who had never once allowed emotion to rule him, now felt an icy fear rising in his chest. His hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white, because in that instant, he was no longer thinking about his empire, no longer thinking about power or position. His mind was filled with one image alone, the image of the girl he had sworn to protect, now trapped in danger. And along with that fear, an old wound inside him was torn open again, the horrifying helplessness of the child he had once been, forced to watch someone he loved suffer and unable to do anything. He had sworn to himself that he would never go through that feeling again, yet now it had returned, more haunting and merciless than ever. But Cormac was no longer the helpless boy of the past. After that first moment of shock, his familiar coldness and sharpness quickly returned, this time heated by a rage unlike anything he had ever known. He answered Brant in a voice so calm it was frightening, saying that Brant would regret ever daring to touch that girl. When the call ended, Cormac immediately mobilized everything he had. He understood that this was a trap his enemy had already set and was waiting for him to step into, but he also knew he had no choice except to walk straight into it. Only he wouldn't enter it as prey. He would enter it as a storm, about to sweep everything away. Night fell over the abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city as Cormac led his men closer. He hadn't acted rashly the way Brant had expected. Instead of charging straight into the trap that had been laid for him, he had used precious time to calculate every move, sending his people to investigate the holding location thoroughly, the number of guards, and every entrance and exit. He understood that in a life-and-death game like this, haste would be paid for in human lives, and he couldn't allow a single mistake when Ruby's life was hanging in the balance. When everything was ready, he gave the signal, and his men silently spread out, sealing every escape route around the warehouse like a net, slowly drawing tight. Inside, Brant's men still had no idea that death was closing in. The confrontation erupted swiftly and decisively. Cormac's men, trained with discipline and moving with absolute control, quickly overwhelmed the panicked guards. The sounds of shoving and shouted orders echoed through the dark warehouse, each man being subdued and neutralized before he had time to react. Cormac moved through that chaos with frightening calm, his eyes sweeping every shadowed corner in search of the girl he had come to rescue. Brant, realizing that his trap had been turned against him and that his men were being defeated with alarming speed, could no longer keep his usual arrogance. He backed away little by little, his face twisted with rage and fear, unable to believe that the perfect plan he had been nursing for so long could collapse so quickly. He shouted orders at his men, but those commands fell only into despair as his henchmen were struck down one after another. And then, in the midst of that chaos, the final truth was exposed. When Cormac drove Brant into a corner, his trusted man stepped out from the darkness, stood on Brant's side, and on his lips was a bitter smile mixed with defiance. Cormac froze for a moment, his eyes flashing with shock as he realized that the brother he had trusted absolutely all these years was the very venomous snake who had quietly betrayed him. The traitor spoke, his voice filled with resentment, saying he was tired of forever standing in Cormac's shadow, that he deserved more than what Cormac had given him. But Cormac, after that first moment of hurt, only looked at him with a cold gaze tinged with pity. He said the man had been wrong to think betrayal would lift him higher, because a man who had sold his loyalty once would never be trusted by anyone again, not even by the one who had bought him. He added that he had already sensed something was wrong, and that greed had made the traitor reveal flaws that a truly loyal man would never have made. As it turned out, Cormac's natural suspicion, though blurred by brotherhood, had never gone out completely, and he had quietly prepared even for this worst possibility. At his signal, those who were truly loyal immediately subdued both Brant and the traitor. The confrontation ended not in slaughter, but in the absolute dominance of an organized force with justice on its side over men who knew only cunning and greed. Cormac ordered the two masterminds held securely, because he understood that for people like them, the most fitting punishment wasn't a swift death, but having to face the collapse of everything they had built, having to pay before the law and before justice for every crime they had sown. Once everything was under control, only then did Cormac hurry off to find Ruby, his heart still pounding with fear for her safety, silently praying that he was not too late. While the confrontation was unfolding outside, Ruby was being held in a small room deep inside the warehouse, and there, she did not sit still waiting for fate to decide her life. As soon as she heard the sounds of chaos echoing in from outside, she understood that the decisive moment had come, and she knew what she had to do. Because before she was taken, during those days when she and the old man had pieced the truth together, she had done something even Cormac had never expected. She had secretly copied all the most important evidence, not only about Gerald's forged debt, but also the clues showing the shadowy connection between her uncle and Lionel Brant, something the old man had accidentally discovered during his investigation. And now, that very evidence would become her strongest weapon. When Gerald, who was also at the scene to witness the success of the alliance, rushed into the room where she was being held in panic, intending to use the chaos to force her to sign the old surrender paper so he could destroy every trace of what had happened. He placed in her hand the very pen he always carried with him, the pen he had used to sign so many dark contracts, the pen that had become a symbol of his power and oppression over her life. But this time, Ruby was no longer the trembling girl she had once been. She took that pen, but instead of signing the paper, she looked straight into Gerald's panicked eyes, calmly revealing that all the digital copies of the evidence had already been securely sent to Cormac's legal team the moment she left the old man's place. She spoke of how he had tricked an orphaned child into signing a contract, of the numbers that had been falsified, and how the truth about his fraud was already in the hands of the most powerful man in the city. And then she delivered the decisive blow, telling him she also possessed absolute proof of his illegal collusion with Brant. Gerald's face changed color, his triumph turning into utter panic as he realized he was already too late to stop his own downfall. At that very moment, the door to the room burst open, and Cormac appeared on the threshold. But the scene before him was not a weak girl waiting to be rescued. It was Ruby, standing tall, holding the pen and the evidence in her hands, driving the man who had tormented her into a corner. And then she did something that left even Cormac astonished. When she realized that the evidence she held could not only save her, but also become the final link needed to bring Brant down completely, the man who was still stubbornly denying guilt outside, she handed it to Cormac and said this was what he needed to end everything fully, so that not one of them could slip away from the punishment of justice. As it turned out, while Cormac used strength to break the trap around them in the physical world, Ruby, with her intelligence and courage, was the one holding the key to breaking the legal trap, the trap that could have bound them both forever. She had not only saved herself, but also saved Cormac, saved the empire and the honor his enemies had wanted to steal from him. The pen that had once been Gerald's tool for writing sentences over her life had now, in her hand, become the pen that wrote his own downfall. Cormac looked at the young woman standing proudly before him, and in his eyes there was not only astonishment, but a deep and overflowing admiration. He realized that the girl he had wanted to protect was far stronger than he had imagined, that she didn't need a savior, only a chance to prove her own strength. And in that moment, amid the wreckage of a scheme that had just been shattered, two people looked at each other and understood that they were not the strong one and the weak one, but two equals who had fought together and won together. The evidence Ruby handed to Cormac became the end for everyone who had committed those crimes. Lionel Brant, the man who had nursed his hatred and resorted to the most cowardly schemes, was finally forced to face the complete collapse of the underworld empire he had worked so hard to build, and he had to answer before the law for everything he had done. The trusted man who had betrayed Cormac also received the bitterest ending, abandoned by the very person who had bought him and stripped of everything. Because in this world, there is no safe place for a man who has sold his loyalty. As for Gerald, the man who had woven the chain of lies that bound Ruby's entire youth, he too was finally forced to face justice. The forged papers were exposed. The fraudulent scheme that had lasted for nearly a decade was brought into the light, and he and his son Wade received the punishment they deserved for everything they had sown. The debt that had once seemed impossible to remove finally dissolved into nothing, just as false as it had always been. For the first time in nearly 10 years, Ruby breathed the air of a truly free human being. There were no more threats, no more fear every time she heard those familiar footsteps, no more invisible weight pressing down on her thin shoulders. With Cormac's care and devoted attention, she finally received full treatment for her illness, and her health slowly recovered day by day. Color returned to her face, and her eyes began to shine again with faith and hope for life. She was no longer the poor waitress who always lowered her head. She had become a resilient woman, someone who knew how to stand on her own feet and take charge of her own fate. She also didn't forget the person who had walked beside her through it all. She helped the old man find a stable place to spend the rest of his life in peace, because the kindness she had once quietly given away had now returned to her in ways she could never have imagined. As for Cormac, that powerful man also found healing for the wound that had followed him all his life. When he saw Ruby standing firmly on her own 2 feet, strong and free, he felt that the helpless child inside him from long ago had finally been comforted. He had not been able to save his mother in the past, but this time, he had not stood by and watched, and that very truth released him from the obsession that had tormented him for so long. 2 people, 2 lives once marked by separate wounds, now found in each other a peaceful harbor, a love built not from charity or pity, but from understanding, respect, and equality. Ruby's story reminds us of one simple yet profound truth, that a person's dignity is never measured by money, status, or the debts that others deliberately place upon them, and that no matter how cruel life may become, the goodness and kindness we sow in silence will one day bloom and bear fruit, returning to shelter us when we need it most. Always hold fast to your self-respect, and never lose hope, because even in the darkest night, dawn will always rise. If Ruby's life story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video so you can hear many more meaningful and captivating stories delivered every day. How do you feel about this story? And what part of Ruby's journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment below to share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Thank you for spending your time walking with today's story. May everyone watching this video always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.